Good morning and welcome to this week's Pastor's Chat. I'm Randy Sherrill here at Fletcher United Methodist Church. A number of times I get asked about stories or events in ministry, and both the funny and tragic things, and often thought about writing some books. But one of the things I've had to realize is that most of what would hold the most interest are tinged or filled with confidentiality, so I have to take those things to my grave. But I thought about my first appointment in the North Georgia Annual Conference when I was doing some postgraduate work, and it encapsulated in those 2 years that I was there a wide range of experiences. I was sent specifically to this church to fix some things. The district superintendent was upfront and honest with me that there were a lot of lingering generational issues that had held the church back, and some difficult things that were going on, some non-United Methodist things. And he charged me in those 2 years to do the best I could to help them become more and more healthy. I can say that in those 2 years I experienced a number of amazing things. I learned a lot. The learning curve was steep. Some of the things I learned were interesting, some were funny, and quite a few were horrifying. Our son Will was born in December of that first year at this appointment. It was a small country church in the foothills of North Georgia. And as we prepared for his birth and then for his baptism in the middle of the winter, we rejoiced in the support that we were getting for raising a young son. We had invited the district superintendent to come in a Sunday in January to baptize Will. But unfortunately, the week, really 8 days preceding that Sunday, was one of the coldest streaks in Georgia in many, many years. For 8 days, it never got above freezing. And the water supply, both for the church and for the parsonage, came from a well on the far side of the church from the parsonage. And over years, the soil and the gravel had eroded, and so that water line froze. And so here we were at home with no water, with a 1-month-old child trying to live. But one of our wonderful families in the church opened up their home to us. And even by that Sunday, when our families came down from North Carolina, we still didn't have any water, so they were staying in hotels in the closest nearby city, and they brought the baptismal water to be with them. And so we boiled it in the church kitchen before we put it in the baptismal font, but the little furnace was working as hard as it could, and it only could get up to about 52 degrees in that sanctuary that morning. And so remember, we had placed boiling water in it right before the service began. But when it came time for Dr. McCoy to baptize Will and to get a handful of water, that water had gotten much closer to ambient room temperature than boiling. And Will was in the middle of a deep sleep. And as soon as that water went on his head, he came straight up to a full tilt scream. And so whenever I work with families and maybe the baby or the young child gets a little fussy or cries a little bit in the baptism, I say, you have no idea. Your child was not at all nearly like our son. I encountered some different traditions around many things, like some of the funeral practices that I was not used to. And one time that I was talking, a couple members in the church was talking about issues, and I said, well, I'm a Southerner too. I'm from North Carolina. And they looked at me with a little side eye and said, son, you're not from the deep South. You're more of a Yankee. So that was a real learning experience. The parsonage we lived in had some major issues. It was built by the church members themselves. Some things that we experienced, we had grass growing in the dining room, because it was a slab house and it wasn't attached very well, the side studding to that slab. And so we had grass that grew up that we had to cut off fairly regularly Kathy, when she was pregnant in that fall, came into one of the bathrooms to a fairly large black snake sunning on the top edge of the tub enclosure. We also had to learn to check our wash that we had put outside on the clothesline to dry, because the scorpions would like to jump up on them, especially the sheets that might be hanging close to the ground. So we had to check that to make sure we didn't have a bad surprise in the middle of the night. One of our members lived right below on the road from the church and had a big pond that was filled with catfish that we never were able to catch other than one time, because he fed them so well every day. But he was getting elderly, and he had asked me, he said, "Pastor Randy, I've noticed that there's a big copperhead that likes to hang around my little pier. Would you come and help me take care of him?" And I said, "Sure." And so he had seen it, and he called me, and I went down, and he brought out his 12-gauge shotgun. And he had it loaded with buckshot. And so as that copperhead got close to the pier, I bent over the side of that pier as far as I could and let loose both barrels. Well, there was no piece of that copperhead left living. There were a couple pieces on me, and I was totally drenched. And he laughed and he laughed and he laughed. One of my church members, who really didn't ever come to church, was the most noted moonshiner in the community, and the church members even let me know, the pastor, that if I needed some moonshine, some good stuff, to help with any of my ailments, I could call a certain number and leave a message and put a $20 bill on my back steps. And the next morning I would have a good quart of the good stuff that I could use. I never ordered any, but that was the definite news in the neighborhood. We encountered some real tragedies and some real challenges. There were nights that I couldn't sleep. There were meals that I couldn't eat. But generally we took on, unfortunately, some very evil things, and finally got through them. And the good people of that church rose up and said, "We're not putting up with this any longer." I did learn a lot. I found out that I was very naive, and I grew up without many difficulties in my early life. But I did learn that evil, true evil, does exist, and it even exists at times in the church. And again, a lot of the stories I can't share because they're confidential. And the last one I'll share is we went to dinner at a family's house, a very good meal. And halfway through the meal, the wife and the family asked me about the greens we were eating. And she said, "Do you know what kind of greens you're eating?" And I said, "No, I just thought they were collards." She said, "No, that's poke salad. And if you don't know how to cook it correctly, it can kill you." And I looked at her and I said, "I certainly hope that you know how to cook it, because I would rather not die tonight." So thank you for listening to these short memories from my very first church. Have a blessed week. Bye-bye.